Okie dokie. So this is exciting. We're moving into our second week and really our first chance to look more substantively at government, start really learning the course materials. So I'm excited about that, and we'll see how this goes. What I've decided to do is I'm taking the slides I would normally present for this week in an in-person class, and I'm basically dividing it into several shorter lectures so that you can watch them, do an activity, and not be overloaded all at once. So please let me know if you have any questions, any feedback on how the course is going so I can adjust accordingly. This lecture is really a very introductory lecture. Basically, I want to make sure that we're all speaking the same language, all have the same basic concepts of what a government is, what it does, and what it's like. I called this Designing Government because it turns out that I'm kind of a big nerd, and when I was thinking about fun things to do in class, really the most enjoyable one I could come up with was sort of thinking about scenarios and designing our very own governments. So at the end of this series of lectures, you're going to have an opportunity to sort of look at some scenarios, hopefully take some time to think about how you would apply this lesson to designing a government in that format. So we'll have some fun with that. So when we talk about government, the first thing we have to answer is what is government? Now, this is how it's defined formally: the continuous exercise of authority and the performance of functions of a political unit. So, basically, a completely useless definition. So, what is government according to me, Jacob Wallace, your government professor? Government is the boss. Government controls a political unit and carries out those functions. So government is the person in charge. This is actually kind of funny. We're working with our kids. Of course, everybody's at home. I have identical twin 7-year-olds. And we're working on very basic government stuff right now. And the title of their lecture was actually, Who's the Boss Today? So this ties in very well. I'm teaching you exactly the same thing, but it's important that we understand these fundamental questions. The big question when we deal with government is who's in charge? Who's the boss? Who gets to make those decisions? And when we sit and think about who's the boss, we really divide it up into several different formats, several different ways of looking at who we can consider the boss. And it's based on a couple of different things. The first one we're going to look at in part one of this lecture is who rules based upon the number of people in charge. So first, we have a system of government where no one's in charge. A state of government, a state of society without any government or any law, where everybody just sort of does their own thing. This is called an anarchy. Now that symbol, if you're old enough like me, which I guess none of you are since this is a high school class, but this was most popular from the bottom of skateboards when I was growing up. But anarchists are a real political movement to an extent. I've never fully been able to appreciate their points, but I do understand them. Basically, if we allow people to freely set up how they want to live, that they can do so peacefully without government interference. That's the idea of an anarchy. No one is in charge. But what about when we have one person in charge? Well, we call that a monarchy. A monarchy is a form of government where one person, who we normally will call a king or a queen, is actually in charge of the government. What about a dictatorship? A dictatorship is a form of government in which one person, normally known as a dictator, rules. Now this brings up a really interesting question. What's the difference between a monarch and a dictator? Now I want you to pause for a second. I want you to think about that. What's the difference? What do you think the difference is between a monarch and a dictator? So pause. Okay, now we're back. I'll pretend like you actually paused. I'm not quite naive enough to think you did, but we'll assume you did. What's the difference? Now, many of you are screaming at your screen right now. You're saying, oh, this professor, he's an idiot. Clearly, a monarch is somebody who has a hereditary rule, and a dictator is somebody who seizes power. That's the one I get every year. But let me ask you a question. The first king of England, William the Conqueror, as you might have guessed from the name, the Conqueror, was not... His dad was not the king of England, right? In 1066, the Battle of Agincourt, he took control of England. So is he a monarch or a dictator? Well, we generally call him a monarch, right? What about this? In Korea, North Korea, we have Kim Jong-un is the leader. His father, Kim Jong-il, was the leader, and his father, Kim Il-sung, was the supreme leader. So we have 3 generations of people who have inherited rule, basically, of North Korea. Monarch or dictator. Well, in almost all cases, we would say that that person was a dictator. We don't generally say Kim Jong-un is a monarch. So some of you are saying, well, okay, but that's fine. So really the difference between a monarch and a dictator is that a monarch is doing good things and a dictator is doing bad things. And I think that might be a little bit closer to the truth. I think the reality is that a monarch is a term we give to supreme leaders when we like them. And dictator is what we call those same supreme leaders when we don't. A great example is King George, the king at the time of the American Revolution. He was, of course, a monarch. But at the time of the Revolution, we began calling him a tyrant and a dictator, right? Because we disagreed with what he did. So I think it's important we kind of bring this up right at the front of the course. Language, especially in politics, is very important. The words we use to describe something frequently have meaning well beyond their textbook meaning. They frequently mean something much deeper. So what's the difference between a monarch and a dictator? Well, we like one more. That's at least my definition. I'm sure the dictionary will disagree with me. Okay, what about a rule by a small group of people? This is called an oligarchy. An oligarchy, and this is a very angsty, great for a high school classroom, political cartoon of an oligarchy. The idea that there are a few people in charge of the society who have all the power, who make all of the decisions, and who actually handle everything. And then the rest of us just sort of work for them. So an oligarchy is a form of government in which a small group of people, called oligarchs, but they have many names, but we normally call them oligarchs, control. So this brings up a very interesting and somewhat depressing question. Is the U.S. an oligarchy? Now, the knee-jerk reaction from I think everyone is no, of course not. We're a democracy. We have individual sovereignty. We're all in charge of this country. So that's sort of the default answer we like to give. But there's a lot of political scientists right now who are disagreeing with that. They're looking at sort of the trend, the direction we're in, the direction we're heading, and they're saying, how many of us actually have access to the government? Let's say that tomorrow I come up with a plan to create total world peace. Me, Jacob Wallace, lawyer and government professor, come up with a plan to create total world peace that would actually work. How easy is it going to be for me to get an appointment with the president? Very, very hard. Let's say tomorrow Bill Gates decides he wants to go golfing. How easy will it be for him to get the president to go golfing with him? Very, very easy. And so when you think about this, and this is really the question of oligarchy, is do we actually have a voice still in our government? And that's a question that's being hotly debated right now. To what extent is the U.S. still a free, fair, and egalitarian country? To what extent have we been sort of preempted by a smaller group of people? So we'll talk more about this as the course progresses. A junta, I include this basically because the chart that I use for this course, let's go back to the chart. The chart that I used for the course had it, and so I have to talk about juntas every year. Juntas are basically military oligarchies. What happens is a military group will take control of a country, and then they tend to keep control. And so they end up being a country ruled by this small group of military commanders. And it frequently happens. There's a YouTube video. You can click on it and watch it. And it's actually about Egypt. Uh, and normally when I think about juntas, I think about South America. Growing up, especially in the 80s, the idea of sort of the military seizing control of the government that became very popular in Central and South America. But this is still happening all over the world. We see in Egypt that this happens. Now, we tend to think when we hear military takes control of the government, that's a really bad thing. And I'll agree with you that that's generally a really bad thing. But one of the things that you have to understand about government is all of them sort of have a purpose and idea. So, for example, when we talk about this one, it sounds really bad that the military just took control. But are there any advantages? Any situations where it might be good for the military to take control? Well, what if the leader of the country is a dictator? What if he's, kidnapping and torturing his citizens? Might there be an advantage to having the military overthrow that individual? What if the country is torn apart by civil war? What if people are being murdered in the streets every day? Well, one of the things militaries tend to do very well is restore order. And so in some cases, we might look at one of these juntas and say, well, maybe it makes sense as a temporary step. And this tends to be what we see. This tends to be sort of the desire. We see this in Egypt was when the military sort of stepped in and took control, removing the leader that had been in power for a while, and generally we did not support. The idea was that it would be an interim step towards democracy. Now, what are the disadvantages, though, of a junta? Well, the big one is, once people get power, they tend to not want to give it up, especially if those people who took power are the ones with all the guns. So, while we might think of these juntas stepping in, the military stepping in to restore order and set the stage for a peaceful election, all too often what ends up happening is they just decide to forget about that peaceful election part and keep power for themselves. There's other things. Militaries tend to not be all that big on individual rights. Free speech, free press, all of those things that we find very important, the military tends not to. And so frequently we find that when these military seize power, they tend to override those fundamental rights many people expect. And so there are some situations where we kind of think a military seizing power might be a step towards a good direction, but in almost every case, it doesn't work out that well. Okay, what happens if we put everyone in charge? So far we've had nobody's in charge, anarchy, one person's in charge, a monarchy, a few people are in charge, an oligarchy. But what about if everyone's in charge? Well, we call that democracy. And democracy comes in two flavors. The first flavor is direct democracy. Direct democracy means that everybody votes on everything directly. So, do we need a new school? Every single person votes on it. What's the funding for the military year? Every single person votes on it. Now, this is an interesting concept. We always like to point to, in political science, we always like to point to ancient Athens as this example of direct democracy. The problem, of course, being that ancient Athens, while it was a direct democracy, is really not a great example because, yes, every citizen of ancient Athens was allowed to vote. But to be a citizen of ancient Athens, you had to be a man, you had to be rich, you had to be the firstborn son of a family, and basically the labor was done by slaves who weren't citizens. So we basically had the situation like we have now in this country where there was really just a small group of people who made the decisions, a senate, if you will, who made the decisions for the country. Now, they said it was a democracy because every citizen got to vote, but how we define citizenship really makes a big determination. This leads to a fascinating question. We'll come back to this one. I like this question. There's a video attached to it. We'll come back to it later, but it's something to start thinking about, which is when we define who gets to be involved in a democracy, we define who gets a voice, how do we make that decision? Because that can make a big difference. Now, direct democracy is good. Everybody gets a say. And there's a lot of good things for it. But it also has some problems. Now, another way to do this is through what we call representative democracy, and this is what we have in the US. Now, instead of me voting directly on what the tax rate should be, I vote for someone I trust, and that person's job is then to represent my interests and the interest of all the people who voted for them when they make the decision. So this is called a representative democracy. So let's kind of compare the two for a second, because there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So direct democracy, obviously there's more participation, more involvement. There are in some ways a better check on the government because the government is literally the people getting together and making decisions. And when we think about many of the things our own government does today, we can say realistically, we probably wouldn't have chosen that. If everyone in the country had gotten together, we'd have some very different laws than the ones we have today. So direct democracy is more in tune with the will of the people, and that's generally a good thing. But why do we have representative democracy? Why do we think that that's a good thing as well? Why not just be direct? Well, there's a number of issues. The first off is very simple. Most of us don't have time to basically be professional full-time legislators. It is very, very complicated to figure out how a city works, how a state works, how a federal government works. And so being able to take the time, the hours, weeks, months to study all of the issues, study how the law works, read thousands and thousands and thousands of pages worth of proposed legislation, amend it to pick out what happens, well, that can be really hard. And we all have to have real jobs and go out and make money so we can eat. So it would be really difficult to ask that of the people. So ultimately, in a country like ours where we don't have a underclass that does all the work for us, and we can't separate out an overclass to be the direct voters, it makes it difficult to create a direct democracy. Also, one of the reasons our founding fathers were hesitant, we'll talk about this more when we talk about the founding, but why they were hesitant was while they trusted in the wisdom of the masses to an extent, there's always a fear in government of sort of the stampede of people responding to a popular issue of the time. Something comes up, people vote on it quickly, immediately, without thinking about the long-term effects, excited by the events of the time, and then they're stuck with a law that maybe in hindsight they wouldn't have liked. And so by having sort of a steadier hand, having these more seasoned people on it, the idea is to protect against it. A good example, back in the early 2000s, there was this big question about flag burning. So, was it legal to burn the American flag? Now, this became an interesting issue. People were doing it as a protest against what they saw as some of the problems in America. But a lot of people really didn't like it. So a lot of states passed laws saying you can't burn the flag. And then the Supreme Court said, well, that's protected political speech. You can't make it illegal for people to burn the flag. And so then there was this big movement to create an amendment to the U.S. Constitution to make it legal to burn the flag. And this was a huge issue. It was debated everywhere. This was moving forward. We were going to get a new constitutional amendment on this issue. And then 9/11 happened. And all of a sudden, flag burning really didn't seem that important. It became a lesser issue because we were focused on other things. And if you ask most people today, should we amend the Constitution to allow people or to prohibit people from burning flags, they'll just kind of look at you funny and say, well, don't we have more important things to deal with? But at the time, that was a huge election-defining issue. And of course, today it seems sort of a smaller background issue with all of the other things we're handling. So in a direct democracy, we would have probably seen immediately bans on flag burning. On a representative democracy where things are slowed down a little bit, we hopefully see more wisdom and a slowness, a consideration in our process. Okay, so that is a lot. I know that is part one of our lecture. Next, we're going to jump on to, now that we know how many people are in charge, we're going to jump on to how they're chosen, but that's going to be the next video I put up. So go ahead, take a break, and then come back in a little while and watch part two of this lecture. Thank you very much.